Buggy the Clown is one of the greatest characters in One Piece. If you disagree, go reread. I think we were all overjoyed to see the reception the live-action version of the Star Clown got, brought to beautiful, scene-stealing life by Jeff Ward. But Buggy the Clown was a legend long before then, and the reasons we originally loved him can be seen back in his first appearance in the manga. Just as the live action can bring the character to life with great acting, the manga brought him to life with great paneling. So let's dig into Chapter 18 and how it used its paneling for action, comedy, and subtle characterization. We start with a wide establishing shot. Understanding where the characters are is key for understanding a fight that uses the physical space around them. Even just establishing the rubble behind Buggy helps smooth out the choreography later on when we see Luffy fly into that rubble. This also shows the large distance between Luffy and Buggy, important for subconsciously understanding why Buggy will begin with a ranged attack in just a couple pages. This page also naturally draws the eye, as when you cross diagonally down from the first row of panels, your eye instinctively passes the two most important parts of the page, Luffy and Buggy, and it does that because it instinctively follows the direction that Luffy's eyes are pointing in. Page 2 is a great example of the power of comedic paneling. The dramatic zoom in on Buggy matches the playful, manipulative build-up in his dialogue. Close-up shots imply that a character's emotions are important and genuine, and two in a row establish a pattern. Luffy, missing the implications and calling Buggy an idiot, then uses a wide shot, not just to pull us out of Buggy's perspective and force us to look at the absurdity of the situation from the outside, but also to break Buggy's pattern. If the panel was a close-up like Luffy's first panel here, then the joke wouldn't work, at least not in the same way, because it would feel like Luffy was going along with Buggy's rhythm rather than breaking it. Coming back from the comedy, we set up the action by showing the reader things that are about to be used. Buggy's array of knives are put into heavy focus as he brandishes them in the largest panel on the page, but we also make sure to show Buggy's shoe knives, as they're going to be used as well. We even have a panel specifically for emphasizing their sharpness, as that counters Luffy's natural rubber defenses and we need to understand that visually. And we smoothly set up the ensuing action with a wind-up panel, as wind-ups consistently make the motion feel more satisfying when we do see it. Except then, to Luffy's surprise and our own, Buggy actually attacks with his legs, not with his arms. Buggy has just pulled off our chapter's first misdirection, so let's go back and talk about how that last page sets that up. The reason that the foot knives are the ones that are used to emphasize sharpness is because they are the ones that are actually going to be used to attack, so that needs to be in our heads. But the story baits us into forgetting about them by brandishing the hand knives in our face, and by having the big wind-up where the pose is that of a baseball pitcher, to make us think that something is being thrown with Buggy's arms. Misdirection is important for Buggy's character because he is a trickster and a coward, and this manifests in his fighting style not through the story showing us an inner monologue, but by the trickery itself being conveyed through the paneling. The action itself uses my favorite trick to mention on this channel, when motion goes from right to left, aligning itself in the direction that the eye moves in, which makes it all feel way more natural. Yet that leftward directionality is used simultaneously with the diagonal shape, which draws the eye straight down to the next panel. From there, we get another leftward motion that feels so natural, but Luffy does get a close-up first. If it wasn't there, it might feel like he's fighting mindlessly, or we might think that he saw this coming instead of being surprised by Buggy's misdirection. Buggy's blades are then established again to remind us that he still has them and he still is going to use them, and it's making sure that them being showcased earlier wasn't actually wasted space just for the sake of a misdirection. We don't actually see the motion of Buggy throwing his knives, yet what happened is clear in spite of that. Their relative positions were established, Buggy's knives were shown, and Luffy's position after jumping in the air was shown. Just seeing that Buggy did something, and then seeing the knives pointing towards Luffy in a radial composition is enough to make it clear. But we didn't skip showing the motion just because we didn't need it. Buggy is still fighting cleverly. He forced Luffy to jump so that he could then trap him with a bunch of knives that Luffy can't dodge in midair. What the paneling conveys by not showing Buggy's attack directly is that Luffy was so caught up in dodging that he didn't see the attack. One moment he's jumping in the air, the next moment a bunch of knives are flying at him. But in a fantastic example of physical, visual choreography, Luffy shows that a rubber man absolutely is capable of dodging things in midair. The presentation on the page is even more impressive than the in-world motions. because we take Luffy from the far right position of a very horizontal panel to the far left position of a very horizontal. It makes it feel like he has traveled across the page as well as traveled across the street. Our eye is drawn across his arm and then is drawn down by his leg, making sure that we see him first in this panel, which in another one of my favorite tricks to mention, makes it feel like Luffy was well out of the way long before the knives hit where he used to be. Buggy gets a close-up too, because how characters feel in fights is just as important as what they do. So we need to see that he isn't phased, that he still has more tricks up his sleeves. We also have another reminder of their relative positions, Luffy, Buggy, Rubble, because we just had a ton of motion that might have changed those positions. This page does do something that I don't love, that I don't think you see in later One Piece's paneling. The camera angle flips so much that even having their relative positions established, I still just find it a little bit jarring. But it also does something that later One Piece often lacks the space to do. It completely decompresses the motion. Manga isn't tied to real time. If an anime tries to show, step by step, every part of Luffy's punch, it'll feel drawn out and slow. That's one of the issues that One Piece's anime runs into, giving every panel it adapts too large a chunk of time. Large panels in manga can convey longer periods of time, but they don't have to. You can also use large panels to emphasize weight or importance, while still having them read quickly. Even if readers take in the page slowly, it doesn't make the action feel slow, and that allows us to show every step of the punch in detail, from the wind-up, to the punch stretching out, to Buggy dodging it. The final panel shows two things that will be important next page. It establishes that Luffy's punch is going far past Buggy, and that position is going to be important. But also, by existing as a panel, it implies the existence of a moment in time where Buggy can think, where Buggy has an opportunity to take advantage of what's in front of him. There's a lot going on this next page. Buggy takes the opportunity he was given, and I love the amount of downward energy here. It's not just the direction he's looking in and the wind-up with his arm, it's that the eye expects to go downward to the next panel. Even though Buggy's motion doesn't actually happen, that same trick of aligning motion with the direction that the eye is moving in makes us expect a strike in that direction. But the direction Buggy is facing is being used to imply his focus. All he sees is the vulnerable arm he can cut off in front of him, and he's not thinking about the hand behind him, the hand that's so small on the page that it's literally out of sight, out of mind. That hand is important because, it grabs the window frame. And that gives us some great dramatic irony because we have such a tight close-up panel of Buggy, which implies that Buggy is really in his own head here. He is solely thinking about his intentions, what he thinks he will be able to do. And that means that, like with the comedy earlier, we can pull out to a wide shot and force him to acknowledge the full situation around him. This page also represents something with Luffy's character. Buggy attacked with a misdirection. Luffy just hit him with a misdirection of his own. Luffy pretended to be punching Buggy straight forward, but he was actually planning on grabbing something past Buggy so he could rocket forward. Was this intentional? Is Luffy secretly a wily fighter, or was this just dumb luck? It's not clear, and that ambiguity is fine because we have plenty of action left in the chapter to figure that out. Starting with a Buggy panel shows that in spite of his surprise, he is reacting in time. He hasn't completely lost the initiative. The Luffy panel then gives the eye a smooth curve to travel down that takes us straight to Buggy's head, and seeing Buggy's head first once again establishes that Buggy has managed to get out of the way well in advance. There's some great shape language in Luffy as he forms a strong triangle that really gives a sense of offense and forward momentum. The page also goes out of its way to show Luffy's pose twice with the arm hanging out to the side. This, and the imagery of Buggy's head popping up into the air, are tools that are going to come back and help us later. The physical nature of One Piece's fight choreography means that if Luffy has all of that momentum and his attack doesn't connect, then we need to see that momentum go somewhere. This is where establishing that the rubble is behind Buggy finally pays off. The two panels of Luffy getting up are a great example of how every panel is being used to convey information. The question, is Luffy okay? The answer, of course he is. It's also a great example of how panel size is used to emphasize importance rather than time. Imagine if the first panel was the large one. The entire sequence would just feel off. Halfway through the chapter, we repeat the imagery from the very first page. Luffy faces Buggy with the exact same positioning as in the panel we saw at the start. This conveys a reset to neutral. The state of the fight hasn't really changed since the beginning, since both fighters have managed to avoid the other's attacks. It also re-establishes their relative positions, as again, after so much motion, we need to understand again where the characters are to understand how they will fight. With their positions in mind again, we can intuitively follow that if Buggy is attacking forward, it's coming towards Luffy, even if we don't see the two of them in the same panel at once. The third panel does a great job of conveying the power that both fighters wield. Luffy's line of action is backwards, and his body is curved with the impact, implying that Buggy has hit hard. But the negative space on both sides implies a lot as well. On the right, it implies that Buggy's attack was fast, like by the time we even got to this panel, it had already crossed all that distance. On the left, it makes it feel like Luffy has bent but not broken. There is all this space that he hasn't been knocked back into. Before Buggy's next move, let's return to his first panel. Buggy's face is obscured here between the angle and his shadowed eyes. This obfuscation implies that something is being hidden from us in his intentions, and the reveal is delivered with his eyes opening. It's another move that's clearly conveyed in a visual way without needing to be really explained. And it's Buggy's next misdirection, making Luffy think the attack is one thing, then revealing that it's another. Luffy has lost his footing in an emotional sense as well as a physical one, and that's really conveyed in how upside down his pose is here. The first panel is also very deliberate in hiding Luffy's expression from us, and that's because it can't spoil the dramatic buildup that we're about to do. The slow zoom here isn't just about panels that are no different from the last one, but they're more zoomed in. Each one is conveying something different. First, the focus is on Buggy's confusion before we move to how Luffy is feeling. This panel raises the question of, how is Luffy feeling, and also, did something happen to his hat? This panel then reveals he is angry, but we don't know why he's angry, and then finally, this panel conveys he is angry because his hat was damaged. When Buggy got a slow zoom in, the pattern was broken, because the matter wasn't really that serious. Luffy's pattern isn't broken. Even when Buggy tries to interrupt, it's this tight panel that can't take away from the situation. We aren't zooming out to take in the absurdity of what's going on. Buggy wants to treat it like it's absurd, and he gets a small, weak panel that shows how pathetic his thought is in comparison to the depths of Luffy's emotions. And we see again here that panel size conveys the importance and weight of a feeling. Buggy's disdain doesn't even get to show his whole face, while Luffy's anger gets the largest panel of the page. The final panel may be small, but I think it's one of the more important ones in this chapter. Once again, it's establishing relative positions that are necessary for following the upcoming action. This time, it's Knife Hand, Luffy, Buggy. But it's also a misdirection that parallels what Luffy did to Buggy. Both fighters used an attack that went past their opponent, and the aspect of the attack that went past the opponent came back to damage the opponent later. Just as Buggy is using Luffy's hat against him, he is also using a way of attacking that Luffy had used himself against him. Because the positions were established, we can follow that the hand throwing a knife forward is going to be towards Luffy, even if again we aren't seeing them in the same panel. We understand what Luffy is reacting to and what he's ducking under. Even though we can barely even see the knife on this panel, we understand what happened. But the knife is also taking place before Luffy in the panel order as our eye travels across here, and this means that for once, Luffy is not dodging in advance. He's lost some of the initiative and he's playing catch-up, and understanding that he's in that position is important for understanding why he could let this next thing happen to him. Buggy has finally pulled off a misdirection. He made Luffy think that he was throwing it at him, and then really went for the hat. I love the size of this panel. It's a very brief moment in time, but the size is being used to make it feel like you're watching a train that's about to crash and no one can stop it. It's aiming towards the hat, and there's not really anything Luffy is in a position to do. Multiple times, Buggy has gotten a tight panel right before one of his plans was supposed to work. It's usually conveyed that he's in his own head, that he's focused on his desires rather than the situation around him. But this time, Buggy's plan works, and we get my favorite example in this chapter of decompressed time. It would be very hard to convey this feeling in another medium, without slow motion or a freeze frame, two techniques that can be used well, but can break immersion if overused. They break the normal rules of conventional temporal movement. The flexibility of time in manga means that this is simultaneously an instant in time and a moment that feels like it lasts forever. It takes as long as the reader feels the need to linger in it. We continue to decompress time as we show Luffy's feelings one by one. We're following the pace of thought rather than the pace of time. We see his shock at what happened, we see his disbelief as the hat drifts further away from him, and we see his mind go back to Shanks. In the anime, this might feel like we're drawing out the moment, but in manga, there's no economy of time to be constrained by, and thus nothing to make the reader feel like their time isn't being respected. Time is, in a surprisingly literal sense, under the reader's control. Buggy continuing to indulge in the way he's hurt Luffy triggers a deeper emotional response. It's anger for sure, but just as we hid Buggy's full expression when we didn't understand his emotions, we hide Luffy's here as we build tension for what his anger will drive him to do, even as he begins to run forward. We also continue to follow Luffy's emotions just in what he looks at, even though we don't see it on his face. We see how he's thinking about Buggy's knives in his hat, and we get a larger panel of his thoughts on Shanks, which I think helps emphasize that Shanks is the more important part of it. The hat is important to Luffy because Shanks is important to him. In our penultimate page of the chapter, we bring in the final misdirection. Luffy runs toward Buggy in the same pose that an earlier page reinforced twice, his arm hanging out to the side. Buggy falls for the trick and thinks that Luffy is attacking that same way, and he even baits the reader into thinking it'll happen that way too by using the same head-jumping dodge. Before, we had a panel that drew the eye to imply an order of events and tell us that Buggy's head was well out of the way before the attack happened. Here, the dodge gets a panel of its own, and doesn't that make it feel like it might be a little bit premature? A manga full of physical, visual choreography can't help but drop some classic slapstick visual comedy. Luffy is, of course, moving from right to left, and has a fairly offensive triangular shape to him. I like how the actual contact isn't shown here. If anything, it makes it feel a little more painful, like the sheer extent of it is too horrifying to allow readers to actually see. Earlier, I raised the question of whether Luffy really planned a misdirection. This moment confirms that he is very capable of that kind of plan, and I think that's an important part of his character. No matter how dumb he is, he's also very smart, in situations that call for it at least, and he's very capable of using his head in a fight, but those situations are going to be conveyed visually, rather than explained. After all, Luffy never gets thought bubbles. This attack also contrasts everything about how Buggy was fighting. Buggy, the coward trickster, only attacked from a distance, only resisted putting himself in danger. Luffy attacked head-on, close quarters, putting his body right in front of Buggy's, and he got the reward of actual damage. There's a nice progression in the chapter. Buggy pulls a couple of misdirections, Luffy pulls one. Buggy pulls one that actually damages Luffy a little, and then Luffy pulls one that really damages Buggy. The back and forth, and the small victory by Buggy before Luffy's big victory helps the finale feel earned. But the thing I love the most about this chapter's paneling is that it's not just about fun action and delivering jokes. So many of these moments don't just tie into Luffy and Buggy's characters, they are their characters. One Piece is a story of actions, and who characters are is defined by their actions, and the best way to show those actions is through great paneling. If this is your first time watching me, I talk about One Piece's paneling every week. New chapters when they come, old chapters on break weeks. If you want to suggest old chapters for me to talk about or argue with me over my interpretations, leave a comment. And if you want to help my videos make their way a little further through YouTube's algorithm, leave a like. I also have a Twitter you can follow if you want to see updates on when new videos are coming, or hopefully some good takes on One Piece. Have a good one.